Press the bell icon on YouTube and don't miss another update.
Namaskar. I welcome you all in this episode of Jaipur Dialogues. Today, I am Pankaj Saxena. Today, we are going to discuss on a very important topic, which was not very popular even among scholars on our side, on the Hindu side, until just about 20 or 30 years ago. But in the past 10 years or so, this subject has really picked up some pace. And various scholars have contributed their opinions, their views, their studies to this very important subject. Today, we have our guest, uh, Dr. Sanjay Dikshit. I don't think I need to give a very elaborate introduction about him. You all must be very, very familiar with him and his work. And he has written extensively on this topic. And what is more important is that he has given some different perspectives on this debate between dharma versus religion, and on the general assertion of the secular liberal side that all religions are same. He is arguing that they are not same, but he has given some new perspectives on this debate. So today we are going to discuss all of these perspectives. Welcome, Sanjay ji, and
Namaste.
I namaste.
Today I'm on the other side, so
Yes, of
I hope
course.
I'm safe.
Yeah, yes. So let us start. Actually, the first thing which comes to my mind when I read your series on dharma versus religion is that how did this question originally come to your mind? Because normally most people don't think about this. Normally people think that yes, Islam is they may be more extreme than us, and Christianity may be more aggressive than Hinduism. But they are all religions, and there may be something good, something bad. Even those who think that there is some difference between Hinduism and Islam or Christianity, even they do not think in these terms that how dharma is a different category or religion is a different category. So how did this question come to your mind originally?
Well, actually, I have this tendency of being a fundamentalist. So
Okay,
fundamentalist
that's
means
very
I
interesting.
go to the fundamental of things. So when we
Yes,
go to the fundamentals of
yeah,
dharma, go to the fundamentals of what is called religion, but basically they are political ideologies. They're not really religions. If you go
yeah,
deeper into them, then you find that there's nothing there except political ideologies, but dressed up as some kind of a philosophy. And even philosophies, it is not proper to call them philosophy. Basically, political ideologies. And these political ideologies in today's world are basically three, though we call them Abrahamic religions. So, Abrahamic religions are basically Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But Judaism has kind of settled with itself, and it is not looking to change the world to its ways. It's self satisfied.
yeah,
So, the
yeah,
third religion, which has arisen, is communism. So these three are the religions, as they call it. Basically, I do not even treat them as religions, but I use the term religion for the sake of convenience because that is the more often used terminology. That is the popular
terminology.
terminology. So that I use only as a popular terminology. Otherwise, they're just political ideologies, or you could even call them cults. Whereas the Indic quote unquote religions, as they call them, the Westerners call them, they are not religions, but they are dharmas. Dharmas in the sense that they are an inquiry into how to make a human being into a divine being. So, this is an exertion or an endeavor to make a human being divine. That is why I also call them that the religions, quote unquote, are what we call theocentric ideologies. Theocentric, and the theo means God in Greek. So theocentric ideologies. So they have a God, and around God, all the discussion goes around that particular God. What that God does, what that God commands, how that God will reward you, how that God will punish you, how you incur the wrath of that God. Everything, that entire religion is obsessed with the God, and that God is used to further some kind of a
Agenda.
political discourse and to achieve political domination through that God. So those are basically theocentric ideologies. Whereas the dharmic ideologies are basically man-centric, or you can call them homocentric or anthropocentric. These are anthropocentric ideologies where the fulfillment of man is being sought, and that is why they are based more on seeking than believing. These are the essential differences. And then after that, what are the fundamentals? I have divided those fundamentals into, actually, I've written the series 6, but you could say 7 categories. Those 7 categories,
Yeah.
I think you have already read about them, and we'll probably be discussing some of them today.
Yeah.
So, those 7 categories are, first of all, the time concept. The time concept is completely different in the 2 different categories that we're talking about, dharmic versus Abrahamic. We have some kind of what is called a cyclical or quasi-cyclical time concept, and the concept in the Abrahamic religions is linear. Linear means it has a definite beginning. God creates, and then God destroys. So there's a definite beginning, there's a definite end.
Definitely.
And after that, there is perpetual hell or heaven. So there's just one life. And they use that one life and God to create a fear psychosis among the human being so that the human being is easily disciplined by the agency. And that agency is either church or the institution of Islam. So they are able to keep their followers in discipline, and they can keep their followers regimented with that kind of a philosophy. So that's the time concept. And then there is the what is called the logic concept or the value concept. So you have the two-valued logic or the binary logic, or you have the what is called the multi-valued logic in the dharmic perspective. We will discuss that when we come to that. Then there is the concept of immanence.
Yeah.
So the immanence of divine or externality of divine. The Abrahamic religions, the God is external. Immanence is, in fact, even to think of immanence is now blasphemy. So there have been times when that has been thought of, but that's been very brutally put down by the politically dominant forces, whether it was church or it was the Islamic forces or the caliphate. So they put down that thought very brutally because that did not suit the political ideology. Then there is the question of the proof system or the epistemology. And the epistemology is also very different because in a binary system, necessarily the epistemology would be confined to just one. And that one is the word of the book. Whatever the book says cannot be contradicted or controverted. Then allied to them, you can treat them as independent fundamentals, or you can even treat them as derived fundamentals, are the cosmology and the epistemology. With the infinite cosmologies, of course, are adjunct to the time concept also. You cannot have a linear concept and infinite cosmology. But if you have a time concept, a cyclical time concept, or a quasi-cyclical time concept, then your cosmologies also become infinite. Similarly, the eschatology, the death and the liberation concept, the moksha and rebirth, all these are also allied to the time concept. You cannot have rebirth in a linear kind of a time concept. You can have rebirth only if your time concept is
Cyclical.
cyclical. And you can have moksha only if your time concept is quasi-cyclical. In a cyclical concept also, there are limitations, because then you end up with what is called eternal recurrence, as Nietzsche used to call it, or Origen in the pre-Nicene era. You know, the Nicene Council, the before Nicene Council of 325, there used to be a very popular concept of what is called Origenism. A person called Origen had popularized it, and that was eternal concurrence, eternal recurrence. And that was taken up by Nietzsche later on. So these are the finer points on which I differentiate these two diametrically opposite systems. Let's call them systems. One is a spiritual system, and the other is a dogma. So what a spiritual seeking system, a seeking spiritual system, versus a dogma of salvation. So these are the two broad categorization that I look at.
Well, that's a very interesting way to define it. In your writings, what comes out first, what strikes out primarily, is that you have discussed science very much while comparing dharma versus religion. So where exactly does science come into this? Because it features very in cosmology, in logic, and in throughout your writings on dharma versus religion, science features very prominently in the debate. So where does science come into this? Because this is if this is a debate between dharma and religion, then how is science relevant?
There is a great misconception about science. That people think that science is also some kind of a dogma. In fact, the way it is taught these days, it is taught on the basis of authority, whereas science is actually a methodology. It is an open methodology of seeking. It is a methodology of inquiry. So seeking and inquiry, the methodology of seeking and inquiry is the scientific method. The science actually comes from the scientific method. If there is no scientific method, there cannot be any science. Whereas what we study as science, and what children and even adults are led to believe, is that, okay, this is some kind of a superior philosophy. And that also is taught on the basis of authority. Okay, Newton said this. So you implicitly tend to believe it. So believing is not science. The scientific methodology is clearly defined. It consists of what? It has historically been defined as the scientific methodology. It is, first of all, verifiability, that whatever is being told to you, that it should be
Has to be.
truth verifiable. Okay, that you could conduct experiments, you could do different kind of inquiries to verify whether the statement that is being made is correct or not. The second element of this, first is of course that verifiability, and the second is universality. It has to be that particular truth that is being asserted must be universal. It cannot be that a truth exists in Arabia, but the same thing changes when it comes to India. The same thing, if that particular gravitational force is being exhibited in Arabia, it should also be seen in India. And it should also be seen on the North Pole as well as on the South Pole. So that universality is another very important element of that scientific method. You have to examine that, whether that particular truth is universal or not. Third is repeatability. That the same phenomenon in similar or same given circumstances must repeat the same way. So if you are bouncing a ball and applying the same force, and it rises a certain height, then given the same circumstances, it should do the same at North Pole, at South Pole, in United States, in India, in China, in Arabia, everywhere. It should not be that that ball drops dead in Arabia and bounces 10 feet in India. then it is not that truth cannot be proven as something scientific. It is that procedure itself is faulty. So that is not scientific methodology. And the fourth and most important, what has happened is, especially Karl Popper prescribed it in the late 19th century. It was in 20th century itself, Karl Popper, and though it was always there, but he integrated into the philosophy of science, because he's a major science philosopher. And what used to be called open refutability, he called it falsifiability. Falsifiability means that any truth should be allowed to be falsified. That means it should be allowed to be proven wrong. Let me give you an example. For instance, if I say 1 plus 1 is equal to 2, okay, and then somebody comes and challenges it. Now, there are two ways of reacting to that. So, the X person tells the challenger, Philip, don't be foolish. This is written in this book, and this is mathematics book by a great man called Sanjay Dikshit. You cannot challenge it, get lost. So that means that 1 plus 1, 2 is not being allowed to be falsified. And it does not conform to the scientific method. Therefore, such a situation cannot be called scientific. Whereas my second disciple, he says, okay, welcome. So what if it is written by Sanjay Dikshit? You have the full authority to challenge it, and you come up with your arguments. You try and prove it wrong. If you prove it wrong, then I will go and tell Sanjay Dikshit, okay, this has been proved wrong with this method. So you try. The man tries. He may succeed, he may not succeed. Suppose he doesn't succeed, that doesn't matter. The idea is that it should be open to falsification. That any truth that you assert, any theory that you assert, in time and space, anybody should be able to come up and challenge it. If it cannot be challenged, it is a dogma. If it can be challenged, then it is scientific. So these are the four basic premises that are attached to the scientific methodology. And on that, if you test almost all Indic philosophies, particularly the Sanatana philosophy, because what has happened is that even among Indic philosophies, a certain amount of dogma has gone in. Okay, like in Buddhism, significant dogma has entered Buddhism. And for instance, even in Sikhism, people like Macauliffe and all, when they came in the later 19th century, and they introduced this dogma and element of Abrahamization. So there also a certain resistance to falsifiability has arisen. But in Sanatana Dharma, even today, this falsifiability element is not just strong, but whenever it is challenged, then a lot of people come up and say, okay, no, that is not the way. You have to allow him to try and falsify. Whether he is able to do it or not is a different matter. And it is with this kind of open architecture that Sanatana Dharma can be called a completely scientific spiritual system. But that is my contention as far as the element of science in Sanatana Dharma is concerned. Now, you don't see that in Abrahamic religion. If you go and try and challenge the word of Bible, you will be declared a heretic. Okay, that's the first thing that will happen. You will be declared a heretic. Yeah. And if you try and challenge the word of Quran, you will not just be declared a heretic, or you will be charged for blasphemy. And the charge for blasphemy in the Islamic nation is beheading. So you risk getting beheaded. So there is absolutely no open inquiry there. There is no element of falsification allowed. The word of the book is immutable. It cannot be challenged. It cannot be altered. Nothing can. You just have to believe. You have to be a believer. You cannot be a seeker there. So they are unscientific. That is my contention as far as this first point of scientific methodology is concerned.
So are you also saying that the way you have defined science, are you also saying that dharma is also a way of knowing?
Dharma indeed is a quest to knowledge. The most important knowledge, self-knowledge.
Yeah.
So everything and anything in dharma has to be rooted through this scientific basis. That is why it is called seeking. Because, as I say, I don't know whether you've read my book, Krishna Gopeshwar. There is a very interesting dialogue between Radha and Krishna, because in that I have shown Radha as she is treated in the lower in bridge, that is 5 years older than Krishna. And she is actually, she becomes a teacher to Krishna. And she tells him, knowing is not seeing. Now you try and reflect on this sentence. Knowing is not seeing. So knowledge is actually, even knowledge is some kind of a path to actually seeing the truth. You have to experience the truth, and that experience is called seeing. That is why the English translation for our rishis is seer.
Yeah.
You must have seen this, that in English, this term is
Philosophy
often
is
used
also
seer.
darshan. Yeah.
Yes, darshan. The philosophy is also called darshan. So knowing is the path to seeing, according to me. There are many people who put it the other way around. But the way I put it is, knowing is the way to seeing. And inquiry is the method. That's like it has been always. Even if you look at the fundamental, again, even if you look at Rig Veda and you look at the Nasadiya Sukt, what does it say?
Yeah.
I mean, you cannot have a more freewheeling inquiry than the Nasadiya Sukt. This is not the occasion for me to recite it here, but people who have known Nasadiya Sukt, they know that is looking at the whole creation in such an open manner and asking whether it is this, whether it is that, whether it can be this, whether gods were before, whether gods are after, whether the creation arose from something or it arose from our mind, whether we came before creation came. All kind of inquiries are there in that particular sutra. 10.129, that is Rig Veda. So that is the way that Sanatan Dharma goes. And that is why I called it a very, very scientific kind of a, very scientific. Also, the all the concepts that are not falsifiable, they cannot be treated as physical concepts. They have to be necessarily metaphysical and therefore dogmatic. So the concept of Ishwar in Sanatan Dharma being falsifiable is a physical concept. Somebody who knows physics will understand this. This is a physical concept in Sanatan Dharma. And in Abrahamic religions, the concept of God being not falsifiable, that's something that you cannot refute. It cannot be physical. Though they call it physical God. It is popularly referred to as physical God, but this is a metaphysical concept. Now, these are slightly difficult concepts. Let's leave them at that.
Practical. Yes. So when you mention science again and again and compare dharma with science and also religions with science, it might sound to some as if you're trying to validate dharma with science. Are you trying to do that, or is it okay to do it or not?
I am talking only about science as the methodology, because science, again, going into the fundamentals of science. You see, you have to distinguish between the scientific corpus and the scientific methodology. So I am not making any validation on the basis of the scientific corpus. What I am saying is the methodology. So this is the scientific methodology, and all the scientific corpus is also a result of the scientific methodology.
Okay.
So if validating one on the basis of the other is a different thing altogether.
Okay. Nicely answered. You mentioned Nasadi Sukta. So to come specifically to that, some scholars claim, and I would also come to that whether claiming this is a right thing or not. Some scholars claim that it describes the origin of the universe or the Big Bang itself. Would you lend some credibility to this or not?
You see, Big Bang itself is a very disputed concept. If you refer to somebody like Dr. C.K. Raju, he thinks that this is something, they're trying to validate the Christian theory of creation. So let's not get into that. And we have to treat Nasdiya Sukta on the basis of the time concepts that we have, and not on the basis of the time concepts as somebody like Stephen Hawking had tried to presume and assume and then tried to engraft the theory of Christian creation onto that Big Bang. So let's not get into that.
Would you accuse Hawking of that? Directly accuse Hawking of that?
Well,
trying to validate Christianity?
Yes. There's a theory. Why don't you? You also heard that. I think
yes, he has been accused. He has been accused in many ways of validating Christianity one way or the other.
I tend to agree with Dr. C.K. Raju.
Okay. So moving on, in one place in your article, actually this is the subject of the later parts of this interview. But Vedas are considered as Praman in our tradition. But then the Muslims and Christians, they also considered their own scriptures as Praman. How is that different from our approach to the Vedas?
I think that relates to epistemology, which is, I think...
it will be covered later on.
It will be covered later on. So when we come to that, we'll discuss that. And let's move to the time concepts now, because that is the... I think
before that, I'd like to just ask you one question about the first part. At one place, you say that Adi Shankar had a final victory on Buddhism. How would you call that final? Because Buddhism is still flourishing everywhere, not in India, but in other countries too. And Hinduism is also, Sanatan Dharma is also existing. So why did you call it final? I'm just curious about this.
That victory, see, again, the concept of victory in Sanatan Dharma
it's
is
very different
not some kind of a physical annihilation.
Yeah,
I think you refer to this victory in Abrahamic terms. So that victory was a doctrinal victory, and that we know that it was a doctrinal victory, and it is even today. Even today, the Buddhists are not able to refute that Buddha was not a Sanatani. He was every inch a Sanatani right to his end. And it is on his deathbed at the time of his Parinirvana. If you read his Parinirvana Sukta, it is at that time that he said that, okay, whatever I was telling you about Atma was only to direct you to more important mundane matters, but Atma does exist. It's there in the Buddhist lore itself. So those are different things, and the way they have constructed themselves later on, all the Sanghas, whether Mahayan, Vajrayan, Hinayan, it is like, the way the church came up. So same way this also came up. So that's a different thing altogether.
Yeah.
So I think you had given me 30 minutes and it's already 29. So
yes, it's already 29. I would like to discuss one point about the concept of time, then we can finish this.
Yes.
I'd like to inquire, why is it so necessary for Christianity to reject the cyclical concept of time, quasi-cyclical or cyclical? Why is it essential to their theology? Why is it essential to their scriptures, their priests, their church? Why is it so central to them?
Before that, let me make one distinction between cyclical time and the quasi-cyclical time. As I said in the beginning, the cyclical time often gets confused with what is called eternal recurrence. And
Yeah.
it will be if eternal recurrence if it is pure cyclical, that is a full
Yeah.
circle. But the Indian concept is more, again, I refer to Dr. C.K. Raju, it is quasi-cyclical. So quasi-cyclical means that there is a tilt in the arrow of time. So it is more like a spiral. And it is
Yeah.
possible for you to get out of that. So otherwise, there will be no concept of liberation. If the time is
Yes,
perfectly
you'll
cyclical, then there cannot be any concept of liberation. That concept of liberation comes because the Sanatan concept of time is quasi-cyclical. And in the early Christian era, they used to treat time as cyclical also. That is why I refer to Origenism and Nietzsche. So this Origenism treats time as perfectly cyclical and eternal recurrence. So this eternal recurrence was anathema to the church. Because the church said that if there is eternal recurrence, that means the Christ will have to come and be crucified again and again. So that did not square up with their political domination ideology. So if they have to dominate it politically, then they have to flatten the time and become the agency that will supervise the gatekeeping into hell and heaven. So that gatekeeper syndrome, which you see in the West, even today, the Western Indology, the Western ideologies, they try and do this gatekeeping. So this gatekeeping was central to the church dogma. And that is why the church flattened the time and said that, okay, this is the flat line and creation happens only once, ends only once. And we are the agency that determines whether you go to the eternal hell or eternal heaven. And that is why I think it was in the fifth council, if I'm not wrong. It was the fifth ecumenical council, and it is probably 552 or 553 Common Era, that the church pronounced what is called a curse on time, a curse on cyclical time. So the church actually pronouncing a curse on cyclical time in itself tells you how important the concept of time or cyclical time or linear time was to the church. And the only unfortunate thing is that even people like Newton, they fell into this kind of dogma, and they also prescribed what is called linear time. Linear time and finite time. And in fact, Newton was the one who predicted that the world will end in 1920. And we are exactly 100 years over. And exactly
it threatened to end earlier this year, but we are safe now.
It keeps changing. The church keeps shifting this date according to its convenience. But the very fact that all the predictions of the church and all the predictions of the Islamists,
all proven wrong.
As far as the end of the world is concerned, they have all proven to be completely false, and that itself should falsify their concept of time. Their concept of linear time should have been falsified. It should have been falsified in science also, because science, in spite of knowing, all the scientists knew that this concept is false, but they kept clinging to it. And it was only after Einstein brought in his theory of relativity that the theory completely ended. That should have ended the mechanistic universe concept also. But the mechanistic universe and the individual rights theory still thrives in the social sciences in spite of quantum mechanics. So these are the certain what I should call the paradoxes that still persist. But the cyclical time versus linear time is I should say, the essential difference. If you say one fundamental, if you say, okay, tell us one fundamental between the dharmic systems and the Abrahamic systems, then this is the one fundamental, the concept of time. In fact, again, I refer to Dr. Raju. It's used a beautiful sentence in his book, 11 Pictures of Time. He says that time is the mediator between religion and science.
Okay. Mediator.
Yes. I think that is it.
Very interesting. Okay, thank you, Sanjay ji. This you have answered these your concepts, shared these concepts on these two subjects beautifully. Next, we'll move on to, in the next part of this interview, we'll move on to the concept of logic and the concept of, and we'll also discuss epistemology. So thank you, and everyone who is watching, please subscribe to the channel Jaipur Dialogues if you like this interview and if you like this line of inquiry. Thank you.
Thank you.